going to start my timer so that I keep myself on time. I always think it's half hour sounded like a long time, and then I start talking, and I sometimes talk about these issues for hours and hours. So, I'm Erin Harper. I am the Victim Witness Program Manager for the Napa County District Attorney's Office. I'm new in Napa County. This is almost my third month. So if I haven't met you yet, please come and introduce yourself to me. I'd love to meet you. You might be asking yourself, if you're new, why are you speaking here? Before I came here, I worked for 14 years at the Children's Advocacy Center in Alameda County. At that center, it's called Calico, I held many positions: forensic interviewer, multidisciplinary team coordinator, state director, and eventually executive director. During that time, we served about 700 to 800 abused children a year. And in my state work, I got to meet centers throughout the state and country providing technical assistance to them and then doing advocacy work in Sacramento. So I got to learn how different communities were responding to child abuse in general, but also child sexual exploitation. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit more in depth about what both Nola and Carrie spoke about so wonderfully, but also to talk about how CACs, Children's Advocacy Centers, can help the community respond to children experiencing this type of victimization. I want to echo what the other speakers have said, which is these are heavy topics, so please take care of yourself, particularly if you are a victim or survivor. I know this can bring up a lot of emotions. And at times when you hear someone speak about something that you've experienced in a way that might not reflect your own lived experience, that can feel bad and icky and bring up even more feelings. So if that's happening to you, that's okay. And I want you to think about something you can do to take care of yourself after this, whether it's calling a loved one, a family member, or doing something nice for yourself before you get home. All right, how many of you all know either what the Courage Center is or what a Children's Advocacy Center is? Okay, good, a fair amount. I'm just gonna do a little overview then, so that I set some context for what we're gonna talk about. The first Children's Advocacy Center was started in the 90s, which to me doesn't sound that long ago, but to some of you it may sound like ancient times. It was actually started in Alabama by a prosecutor. CACs were originally started to help child sexual abuse victims. And what happened was this prosecutor had 3 cases that went nowhere. The first 2, the child victims in these sexual abuse cases, stopped participating, they shut down, they refused to answer questions. The third case, the child had been interviewed 21 different times. She was still willing to participate in the prosecution, but by the time she went to get on the stand, she had given so many different statements to different people that the defense attorneys were picking apart small details and variants in those different statements to make her look like she wasn't credible, even though the core disclosure of her abuse stayed the same. So why did that happen? I mean, you can imagine if you ask a child the same question 21 different times, you're not going to get the same answer 21 different times, especially if you have different people asking that question in different ways. Children process information and questions very differently than adults, and their ability to answer questions changes as they mature. That makes sense. But for example, if I ask a child, say a 5-year-old, what color was that man's shirt? That man's shirt was red, right? Was that man's shirt white, blue, or red? And was that man's shirt red, blue, or white? I'm going to probably get different answers to each of those questions. Does that change if the child doesn't know what happened to them? No. So this prosecutor named Bud Kramer had these cases happen and said, we have to stop. We have to do something better for these kids. So he started the first center where it became a child-friendly place to take a child to be interviewed by someone trained to talk to children. That interview was recorded so that anyone who gets involved in the investigation later can just watch the tape and they don't need to re-question that child over and over. It's also observed by what we call a multidisciplinary team, or MDT, that is normally made up of a prosecutor, a law enforcement officer, and a child welfare worker. That makes sure that in that one interview, all the questions that each of those people may need asked to do their jobs well get asked at one time. CACs have evolved beyond just doing interviews. They now do support work for whoever the protective adult is taking care of that child. And the other main service that I want to talk about today is they do case reviews. So monthly, they hold reviews where they have medical providers, mental health providers, the DA, child welfare, law enforcement all come together to talk about not just that case, but the child's and family's needs to make sure that nothing is falling through the cracks and that everyone involved in protecting that child is supported as the case moves on. The idea is to achieve not just justice for the child, but healing as well. So in the beginning, as I said, the center started to serve child sexual abuse victims. Human trafficking and CSEC victims were not brought to CACs. Largely, that was due because children, as Nola mentioned, were criminalized in these cases. So they weren't seen as needing a victim-centered approach, and CACs were seen as much too soft for these kids. And I say kids because it's boys and girls. As views towards this issue have changed, and as there's more recognition that these are children and victims, it makes sense that they be brought to the CAC, and CAC services used to treat them and help intervene in what happened with them. In addition, in the beginning, CACs were like, this is an issue that we don't have the tools to deal with. In the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot more training given and development and research gone to support the work of CACs in responding to CSEC claims. So I have a slide in front of me, if that sets the context for what a CAC is, and a little bit about the history of how they started slowly to be used in CSEC cases. Again, not widely, but it happens. I want to talk about what are options for Napa County, Delano County, Alameda County, if there's people from other counties here, what are options for your home county? Before I do that though, I just again wanted to highlight for you, and I have a slide here, but I'm looking at it. I think it's a great slide. I'm not going to just read it to you guys, but I want to talk a little bit more about myths versus facts, because I want you guys to go home and be good advocates for this issue and advocates for children who are victims of this issue. Now, Nola and Carrie both talked about the realities of what human trafficking is and what it looks like for children in particular. And the reason I'm hammering this point home and going to be slightly repetitive is because I want you to be able to educate people in your community and in your life so that they know both what services are needed and who needs them and how to better protect children in their community and in their homes. We all know most of these facts. I think a lot of what I'm going to be saying and what you've heard, if it's new information, it's probably not surprising, but for a lot of people who don't work in these fields, there is a very large and deeply held misconception on what human trafficking is and what CSEC is. I have, on my slides, there's a poster of the movie Taken, and then a poster of the movie The Sound of Freedom. Those both depict human trafficking in a way that it's suburban girls snatched and then trafficked abroad. Does that happen? Yes, yes. Is it the most common form of CSEC? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But to a lot of people, that's what they hold in their mind as being trafficking. I am a firm believer that there's no such thing as a stupid question, but I've been in positions where I've really been tested in that belief. And it's often on the subject of CSEC. So where I used to work, the CAC is a nonprofit, so we do fundraisers. I go out and talk about these issues, and I take questions. And I love questions, but again, there's a couple that were just like, oh, oof. I'm really holding tightly. So like honoring your curiosity here. And one was a woman who asked me, does that really happen in America? Yeah, absolutely it does. Another person I had my daughters there. I have a daughter whose hair color, my hair color, and then a blonde hair daughter. I don't know how that happened, but I'm not a geneticist. I had a woman come up to me and ask, "Are you worried about your younger daughter, the one with the blonde hair, getting trafficked?" I was like, okay, that's rude, but also, what? Why? Why her? She said, "I've heard," we were talking about it in my book club, that traffickers like blonde-haired girls because they get more money when they sell them overseas. I was like, we have a lot to unpack there. So I'm offering those to you as examples to say what other people might be thinking about this issue and why it's important for us to be able to take the right information and educate those people that we might be interacting with. So one, there is a belief that traffickers target victims they don't know. Sometimes, sure, but most often traffickers have some type of relationship with children they are trafficking. It only happens to girls is another myth. I am so glad Carrie and Nola hit this home to you guys. It can happen to children of all genders, boy, girl, non-binary, any child that can be trafficked. Another myth, all trafficking involves sex. I promised I would not open the can of worms of labor trafficking, and I'm not going to open that can of worms because I don't know much about it, but I want you guys to know that can exists. Children are labor trafficked. That's a topic for the future, but I want you all to be aware of that. And last, another myth is that human trafficking always involves smuggling children, particularly across borders. Again, it can, but not most often. Children can be trafficked in their hometowns and even in their homes. So given those myths and the reality that we just talked about, I wanted to walk you through a few examples of cases that I personally interviewed children for to show you the array of different types of cases that can come through a CAC. And I'm not going to go into details, so I don't want to traumatize you, and I also know we're short on time, but I'm hoping that these examples will kind of flesh out some of the points of entry that Nola mentioned in her slides. So she talked about familial trafficking. That's a rather common one, more common than we'd like to think about. I have interviewed several sibling groups, mostly involving young children, so we're talking 3 to 10, 11, where their parents, often the mother, because not all traffickers and exploiters are men, it can be the women, was offering access to her child to perform sexual acts on men for money or for drugs. That was happening in their own homes. Those cases came to us thinking they were pure sexual abuse cases, and then as we interviewed the children and got more facts, as the investigators gathered more facts from their investigations, it became clear that those children were being trafficked by their parents in their own home. There was a teenage boy, a 15-year-old, who came out to his parents as gay. His parents were really furious. They did not kick him out, but they made living at home pure hell for this boy. He was being physically and emotionally abused and taunted because of his sexuality. So he started spending more and more time outside of his home. And he met an older man who said, "Hey, I'm looking to rent a room in my house." And the boy said, "Oh, I can't pay rent. I don't have a job." And he offered in exchange if this boy performed sexual acts on him, he'd give him the room. So that's how the boy paid his rent. When he came into my center, you know what he told me? There was no physical violence. He liked the spot. It was better than where he lived. He said, yeah, the guy was a little creepy. He didn't love what he had to do, but he liked living in this house compared to where he was. I spoke to a girl who had a history of 4 different foster placements. As a child, her mother had undiagnosed mental health issues, and so had lost custody, regained it, lost it, regained it. While this girl was in a group home, she met another girl who was being trafficked, who recruited her into it. At first she thought it was great because she was making money, and then she began to experience more violence, and she was very upset. She was angry to be found out, angry to be talking to me. She asked me, "Why are you such a nosy B-word?" My answer to her wasn't great from a forensic interview standpoint, so for being vulnerable. This was not a highlight of my professional moment, but for the sake of the story, I'll just finish it out. I answered, and again, if any of you are interviewers in here, this is not something to do. I answered her because I get paid to be a nosy viewer. And she was actually okay with that. She said, "Do you like it?" And I said, "Yes." And then we continued talking. So it worked out, not forensically sound. I won't be teaching Jessica that response. But she was angry. And you know what? Honestly, she should be angry. She was mistreated. She had not had a fair life. So I thought her anger was completely understandable, justifiable, and I liked seeing that anger in her because it meant she still had a spark, that she still knew she deserved better. There was a young woman who was an adult. Because at the old center, we did interviews of adults with developmental disabilities, so she had a pretty profound developmental disability. Her boyfriend was trafficking her. She loved her boyfriend. She had wanted a boyfriend her whole life. She told me in the interview how wonderful he was, how much she loved her. She could not be, I wasn't trying to persuade her otherwise, but she could not have been persuaded otherwise. So to get her to keep talking, I just kept asking her more about the nice things her boyfriend does, what else she does with her boyfriend, what does he ask her to do. For her, again, she didn't come in, much like the boy who was looking for a home. She didn't come in upset, fearful, wanting to be saved, wanting to be served. She just wanted to talk about her boyfriend at this point. Then there was a teenager. There was a teenager from a nicer suburb whose parents wouldn't let her have a nice iPhone like this, just a flip phone. So she was using her friend's iPhone to download Snapchat while at school and talk to people. And she met someone on Snapchat who talked to her about how pretty she was and how he'd give her some money just to go out to dinner with her. And she'd heard of the sugar baby thing, so she's like, "Great, I'll be a sugar baby. I'll get enough money to secretly buy myself a better phone that my parents won't know about." And that started her entry into being trafficked. These are all different ways that children can present. These are all children served at a CAC given a victim-centered soft interview that was successful. There's a spectrum of ways CACs, Children's Advocacy Centers, can be used. And on my screen, I have this spectrum where it goes from no involvement, where it's like, CSEC, we don't want to see it, don't bring it to our center. Sounds like a catchy slogan. To the other end of the spectrum, where all cases are given full suite of typical CAC services, all trafficking cases, all CSEC cases are going to be run through their center. The no, CSEC don't bring it to us, that's less common now. We're going to do everything the way we do for any other type of child maltreatment, treat CSEC exactly the same, is not as common. Most fall in the middle, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I do want to highlight for those centers that do it, they tend to actually be located in areas that had those stars in Nola's presentation. So Miami, Baltimore, DC, they all run really extensive CSEC programs. They interview all CSEC victims at their center. They also offer drop-in programs and other things for CSEC victims. Again, though, outside of the Eastern Seaboard, it's a little less common to see centers, to see communities choosing to use their CAC for all CSEC victims. I apologize for the amount of acronyms in that one sentence. So what does the middle look like? The middle looks like what most of the country is doing. We have different options. You can do what they do in Alameda County, where you interview some CSEC victims, but not all of them. So maybe you're dealing with the really young kids, children who are especially vulnerable, children who are ready to disclose past victimization or ready to talk about what happened, doing interviews for jurisdictions that might not see CSEC as much, so want a specialist to come in. You can use the CAC to do either some, all, or none of the interviews. Again, it's up to a community to decide what's best. but still use the CAC to coordinate the broader team to do trainings, case reviews, create a CSEC protocol, and organize follow-up services for the victims. So it doesn't have to be just the interview. There's a mandate in California that all counties have to have some type of CSEC working group. The players on those CSEC working groups are often the same players that are part of the MDT, the multidisciplinary team, at the Children's Advocacy Center. So it makes sense to use the CAC from a resource standpoint, since they already are bringing this group together, to use them to talk about CSEC issues. You can use the team members that are the medical and mental health providers for the Children's Advocacy Center to provide the medical and mental health treatment and follow-up for CSEC victims, even if they're not being interviewed at the Children's Advocacy Center. Another idea, one that I love but I don't see getting a lot of traction, is if the team decides they don't want a forensic interviewer to do the interview, is to still use the CAC if it has an adolescent room where it doesn't look too kid-like. But if it has some type of interviewing room that's neutral and comfortable, have a law enforcement officer use that room instead of taking them to a police station. In addition, there's not just local law enforcement that can use it, but the FBI. The FBI has entered into a national MOU with the National Children's Alliance that accredits CACs, I was gonna say all CACs, it accredits CACs in the US. In California, of the 58 counties, 21 of them have an accredited center. Napa County is one, so we're really lucky here. When the FBI uses the facility, they bring in their own victim advocate and their own interviewer, but they're using the CAC's equipment and facility. I think it's a great solution. Erin, you'll hear from in a little bit, putting you on the spot, mentioned to me a case that she had where it was adult trafficking victims, and they brought in all of the children to interview. So I think that's a really creative way to use the CAC, to ask the children both what do they see with their parents as witnesses. Children see a lot of things, but also to see what did they experience in their own home. And one of the most powerful ways that a community can use their CAC is prevention and identification. Nola touched on this more than once. It's so important. One of the biggest risk factors is child abuse, particularly child sexual abuse. It's one of the biggest risk factors for a child to then end up being a CSEC victim. That does not mean that all CSEC victims have been sexually abused. And it 100% does not mean that every child sexual abuse victim is going to be a CSEC case. But there's that overlap. And if CAC's primary mission is to serve child sexual abuse victims, we are in this unique, special spot to be identifying who's most at risk and providing early interventions. There are screening tools that are nationally researched and evidence-based that can be used after meeting with a child. And even if you don't work at a CAC, you can use these tools after you meet with a child. And you rank certain risk factors and it gives you a score to see how much at risk children are to be trafficked. I think this is an incredibly powerful tool for, like I said, any youth servicing agency to use, but particularly CACs. One way they can be used is to use it routinely after every interview, run the screening tool, and use it to make special referrals for that child, and then discuss those scores at case review. So at case review you can say, this child pinged really high on this, what are we gonna do about this? How are we gonna give extra resources for this child? It's a unique moment where there's already intervention being provided to that child and family that can be capitalized on by using these tools. And if you'd like more information about them, come get a business card from me because I can email them to you. There's one that you have to take like a training on to use correctly, which, hey, I think you should be taking a training to use it anyway, and it's free. It's developed by the West Coast Clinic, which those of you from Alameda County probably know. All right, so guiding principles for working with children in these cases is to understand trauma and coping mechanisms. I'm not going to go into that in depth here because I know you all have those skills, but understanding that it's not the first time a lot of these children have interfaced with our systems, so they may not be coming in super cooperative. And like I said, that's okay, we can work with that. You don't need to try and talk a child out of being less angry or less frightened. You meet them where they're at. Some of them might be very resistant to engaging with services. That's okay too. If you are working with a C-sec victim, do as much as you can to take them to adolescent-friendly facilities or places or rooms. And I know I mentioned that earlier, but it bears repeating. Do not take a C-sec victim who's older. It's fine for the littler ones, but for an adolescent, into a room with like Dr. Seuss paintings and quotes. They're gonna feel very alienated by that. Keep them talking. If you get them to talk, don't interrupt them. Don't dispute their facts or interpretations, so that, for example, with that young woman who had the boyfriend, it was not for me to say, he is not your boyfriend, he's not nice to you, you've got a bruise on this, like, what are you talking about? No, you just validate what their experience is and keep them talking. Don't question their motivations either. And of course, as is true when you're talking to all children, don't cut them off or interrupt them, but keep them going as much as they can. It's a big step for a child to disclose what's happened. Only 6% of C-sec victims will disclose what happened to them, even when and that's 6% of verified victims. So victims where there was some evidence, concrete evidence, that they were being trafficked. Only 6% opened up to say what happened to them. That's not unlike child sexual abuse victims. When a child discloses to you, whether it's trafficking or sexual abuse or any other type of abuse, that is they trust you, and that is a very special moment. So the extent you can say you believe them, let them know that they're safe, and keep them talking, that's the best way you can help them in that moment, and the best way you can help the rest of the systems designed to protect them and keep them safe understand best what's happening to them. And last, and I don't think this is as huge of an issue as it used to be when I first started working back in the dark ages, is to treat them like victims, not criminals. I've had girls brought in handcuffs. Do not do, to the extent possible, do not do a victim interview of a child while they're in handcuffs. Particularly if that's being videotaped, don't do that to the child. If they're being brought from a juvenile detention facility, not only do I not want them in handcuffs while they're being given a victim interview and treated as victims, if they're wearing their clothes like the sweatsuit from the detention center, give them the option of changing into something else. Even if that means you're going down to Target or Old Navy and buying a few shirts for the child to pick out, give them that option so that they have some dignity and are treated as victims in that moment. So, I've thrown a lot of different subjects at you. I only had a half hour. I was touching on a lot of different things. If you have questions, I'll be on this panel, but you can also find me later. This is a subject I feel very passionate about. I really appreciate being given the chance, thank you Shay, to speak to all of you. And I'd love to talk to you more about this, but I just want to leave you with a few takeaways that trafficking doesn't always look like it does in the movies, but a lot of people think it does. And it's on us to advocate not just for the kids in our lives, but the kids in our communities and those we don't know, and that includes educating those around us. So thank you.